Justice League number 211. And I bought this at a People's Drugstore in 1983. It was actually the first comic book I ever bought. And from here, I became a comic book just fiend. And I collected comic books all the way up until my mid-30s, until I just got tired of transporting them around, and I hadn't really been involved with them well. I ended up selling them. The reason I bring this up is, one, it's the same year the game that came out we're going to talk about, and two, when people talk about collectibles, a lot of times they talk about holy grails. And holy grails can come in a couple of different ways. They can either come from collecting something and really hoping you'll get the most valuable of whatever item, like us. So like we collect records, and some records are obviously worth a lot more than others. So that might be someone's holy grail. Or it could be something very, very rare that there's only a handful that survive still. And that could be someone's holy grail for collecting. Well, the game we're looking at today is my personal holy grail, one that I've been looking for well over the 20 plus years I've been collecting. And even though it's not the rarest game out there, it is a little difficult to find. So I'm really excited to share it with you because it's a pretty good example of it. I used to spend my summers in Ocean City, Maryland. My grandparents had some property there, and there's a giant boardwalk there in a place called Playland, which is a huge arcade. And that's where I first played Crystal Castles in the late summer, probably early fall of 1983. I immediately fell in love with the game, and I've always loved Playland, and it's actually still there and still running. It's one of the most genuine arcade experiences you're ever going to have. This is still what it looks like. It still looks like an old arcade from the 20s or 30s. I was disappointed, however, when I went back the next year in 1984 and the Crystal Castles was no longer there. I guess either a victim of not being popular enough or possibly just being broken. Now, I was a pretty big fiend with video games, and of course, like a lot of kids, pretty versed of what was coming and going. And 83 was a pretty banner year for arcade games. And I was pretty excited about Crystal Castles because it seemed to just kind of combine a lot of the things I love. And I was pretty loyal to the Atari brand, I guess like a lot of kids, since I had an Atari 2600. There was a lot of games that came out in 83 though, and it's possible that Crystal Castles was just not more popular because of the downturn of the market, or so many other games that came out like Dragon's Lair, or Mario Brothers. Gosh, so many games came out that year. But I never saw it again in an arcade. In 1984, I picked up a copy of Crystal Castles for the Atari 2600. Now, obviously, the Atari 2600 was a little underpowered compared to the typical arcade game, but I always felt this was actually a pretty good version of the game, considering the Atari 2600's limitations. Later in the 80s, I was able to pick up a much more authentic version that came out for the Atari ST computer. But even then, I still always kind of hoped that one day I would own a full-size version of the game itself. So here's the game. It's our Crystal Castles upright. It's looking pretty sharp. It did not quite look so sharp when we first got it about a month and a half ago. So let's go through the process of what we did to it to get to this point right now. I bought this game online from a company called Coin-Op Warehouse, who specializes in vintage vending equipment and kind of game room accessories of all sorts of ages. And I really liked this example because it was complete. It had been sitting in a warehouse for quite some time, and it had been unaltered. It arrived in about a week or two. It was nicely wrapped up, as you can see, and it made it trip across the country pretty much all in one piece without any major problems. First inspection was very dirty, but we actually got it to work somewhat. As you can see, the monitor is in pretty bad shape. The trackball controller sounded like it had gravel in it. It barely worked. Just rusted parts inside there. And the graphics on the screen, although you could play them, they were actually all corrupted, and they looked like little Venetian blinds, and the colors were all completely wrong. And you can see there the marquee is taped together. And as we cleaned it out, we even found some rat's nest material, which is always kind of disgusting. First order of business here was to repair the trackball controller, which was pretty unusable. So we opened up the control panel there, and we took it out and started to inspect it and realized that the rollers
that make the trackball go were all rusted and corroded. You can see a little divot there from years of usage. So we purchased new ones from arcadeshop.com. You can really see the difference there. The ones on the left are brand new and shiny, and the ones on the right are just terrible and pathetic. And then after that, I went ahead and scrubbed the original control panel down, wanting to preserve the original one since it was actually in pretty good shape. And you can see now it's all clean, and it's hard to believe, but that is the same control panel. And from that point on, we started just kind of doing some general cleaning of the game as we went. Next, I turned my attention to the audio regulator board. These are commonly found in almost every Atari game, and it's just a matter of putting some new capacitors on there and a new power transistor. And here we have the monitor. Oh boy, look at the burn-in on this thing. Crystal Castles is pretty well known for its terrible burn-in of monitors, and there's no screensaver on this one, so it's just you can see the instruction set and the demo maze there pretty strongly. Eventually we'll have to put a new tube on this thing, but the chassis itself was extraordinarily dirty. This is an Electrohome G07. Now this is not typically the monitor that Atari used from the factory, but this is indeed the factory monitor, and we went ahead and recapped it, we scrubbed it and cleaned it, put a new flyback on there, a new hot, as well as changing that big cap you see there, that B+ voltage, which is pretty critical. And once we finally did all that, it started looking pretty good. It took a little while to get dialed in. Had a little bit of an air interference problem that had to be taken care of, but then, as you can see, it's pretty much set to go there with a nice clear picture without too much wiggly-do or any sort of interference at this point. It's looking good. Next up is the rather unsexy job of rebuilding the power supply. On a lot of arcade games, people tend to replace the power supply with a new switching one, but the Atari ones are very easy to rebuild, and you definitely want to clean them out and change that big blue capacitor, especially after you've recapped the monitor and the audio board. Here's the bottom of it, making sure things go where they need to go, and then you want to scrub out that fuse holder and make sure it's making really great contact with everything. And I like to put new fuses in there because usually they're pretty oxidized, and that can actually affect performance and give you some interference issues. The main CPU, actually, I ordered another one from Todd Tuckey of T&T Amusements, and that's the one we ended up using. The original one has a RAM error that eventually I'll fix. I just haven't done it yet, but it's always good to have a backup board anyway. On Crystal Castles, instead of a traditional marquee where it's just a kind of a glass or a plastic logo with a backlit fluorescent bulb behind it, this is a little more complicated because there is a mylar that goes over top of a piece of glass and a wood kind of surround, and underneath is a speaker grill that also has a section that lights up with a diffuser in the middle, and it's all held together by these big heavy mylar, essentially large stickers, and they need to be replaced because they were cracked and the one in the middle was missing. So I got some reproductions. These were older reproductions. Nobody currently makes a really good one. This old game makes the bottom section but not the top section currently. So you take this thing apart, and there you can just see the diffuser as we've taken the top bit off, and what's left of the speaker there, and it's kind of an interesting thing. It reminds me of some of the glass they use for bathroom lighting fixtures. And you have to be very careful when you disassemble this thing, because as you take the old mylar sticker off, the glass underneath, and this is just the bottom with the light, is only held together by the mylar sticker. So you have to be very careful not to have it fall out and break, because then you're going to have to get a new piece cut. And so, I used a little bit of heat gun here and a scraper, and slowly but surely got the old one off. As much as I hate getting the old stuff off, it was so deteriorated, the glass was falling out of it, and last thing you want to do is break the glass. So there it is out, and then I took the sander and I cleaned it with some of the edge work just a little bit, even though it never was originally that fine or gray, and I just wanted to make sure the sticker was as even on there as possible when I put the new marquee mylar on. So put the glass back in place after cleaning it, and we carefully put the new mylar on, and then we kind of line it up to see, and hey, that looks really great. It looks 10 times better than it did. So the bottom one is a little trickier, because it's a lot more angles and folding. So the old one, just a mess. It's missing the center part. So we're going to take all that off and try to get all the sticker stuff off, which is going to take a lot of sanding, a lot of elbow work to get all this off. And this took a while because it's kind of a graded metal. I have a little hobby sander that I use for these kind of things just because it takes longer, but it's much more control. And there you can see it's slowly but surely coming off, but we got it down to bare metal. And then once we got it down to bare metal, I painted it with some satin paint, just a rattle can spray pan. You know, you could powder coat this thing if you wanted to, but I'm just not that fancy. I usually don't do that, but maybe I should think about starting to do it. Then we put the new Mylar on. There's a little glass piece behind that Atari logo, just like on the big one. That luckily it hadn't broken, but somebody had thought to put it in the coin box, and it looked great. The only problem is these reproductions are not as thick, the Mylar, as the original, so some of the light cascades through more than it should. So what I did was I came up with kind of a novel solution. I bought some tint they put on windows for houses and cars, and on the back side I simply wrapped the tint on the back and then cut out with an X-Acto knife the part of the logo that should show through. And I did it for both the top of the Crystal Castles logo and also the bottom with the Atari logo. And I didn't know if this was going to work or not, to be honest with you, but it actually worked out a lot better than I thought it would until someone really makes a fantastic reproduction. This is going to have to do, but I don't think a lot of people would know the difference. And so you can see there, now it lights up perfectly. There's very little bleed now compared to before. It was just everything was backlit and it looked kind of crappy, but this made me pretty satisfied with how it turned off, or turned out, I should say, and a lot better than the old cracked one. Plus now we don't have to worry about the glass pieces behind those Mylars coming out and falling down and breaking. Next up was this atrociously rusty coin door, which somebody had epoxied one side of it shut, actually the coin mech. So we can see it from behind, just rusty, dirty, gross. The coin mechanisms were actually missing as well. Somebody took them out a long time ago. And so we took the bucket out that has the controls and the counters for the coins, and just, nasty. So good cleaning, good scrubbing. You can see one side only had 700. That was the side someone had epoxied off, and the other play counter had 50 grand, which is pretty good. So somebody made some money off this game 1 quarter at a time. So there are our terrible coin doors and coin bucket, and we're going to take them all apart and just strip them. The first thing I did was take apart the coin bucket. So you can see here I took off the mechanical part of it with the buttons and the coin counter. I wanted to save that Atari property sticker. I thought that was pretty cool, so we taped that over before we start sanding and cleaning. And then this is the top portion. The back looks pretty good, but all that has to come off and come out because we're going to sand this down to the bare metal, because the front of it was pretty corroded and rusted, as you can see. So all that stuff comes off, sand it down to bare metal, and then we're going to give everything a nice coat of paint again. And once it's done, voila, man, it looks brand new, all clean. Got to save that Atari sticker, looking good. Looks better. It was really rusty in the bottom too, which I didn't take a picture of, but it's starting to look brand new again. This is one of those things probably people will never ever see your game, but it makes a big difference, some of these little detail items like this, just knowing that it's there and it's correct and perfect. And coming up here you can see the side-by-side comparison of what it was and what it is again, and it's looks factory funky fresh now. And then we address our concern to the rest of the coin mechs, where we take them all apart and obviously clean them, and all these metal pieces you're going to have to get sanded. I bought new coin mechanics and new buttons, since this is the one that had been epoxied over. These were just useless and ruined, so those go in the recycling bin. I always like my games to work on quarters. Some people don't really bother with that, but to me it's part of the experience and importance. These are all the behind the scenes mechanics here. So you can see I'm starting to sand the holder of the top and bottom door. I'll put those out of order, just ignore that. This is the door, and this was the bottom door. It was just cavalcade of rust. It took me forever to finally get this thing. You see how pitted it is even after sanding it. And there is the repainted shroud back on there with the coin keeper and the buttons and the counter in there. And then we are finished with the new doors. and the locks. And we're going to put our bucket back in there when we're finished. And voila, it looks brand new with some nice lights in there. And man, what a difference. And this makes a big thing. Some people don't restore their coin doors. I don't know why, because it's the first thing people see. So not a big surprise, something like this that's been sitting in a warehouse for a couple of decades is filthy. So clean as you go. Usually when I first get it, you want to vacuum it out the bottom and scrub it out the best you can. This game had some remnants, as we saw before, of rodents. Luckily we didn't find any dead creatures inside, which is always a plus. I like to use magic erasers to clean the sides of these Atari games, but you have to be careful with the magic erasers on most surfaces, like the silk screened games or the stencil games like the Williams games. It can actually bring the stencil off, so proceed with caution. You know, there's a little bit of damage on the cabinet, but it wasn't too bad. There are a couple little spots on the top, and there was some issues on the bottom on the right side, and here you can see some of the damage on the top. Not too significant. I just used some wood putty and spackled it over. On the right side, it was a little more significant. Looks like it took a knock at some point, and then we filled that in with wood putty and sanded it down the best we could. You know, some people like to use you know, Bondo here, but that's kind of a judgment call. The feet on the bottom, very rusted. Usually these are missing, so I was kind of shocked that they were all there. Unfortunately, they were kind of useless. You couldn't adjust them. They were so rusted over and broken. These leg levelers and these feet, or whatever you want to call them, they're pretty critical, and I think a lot of people tend to miss putting new ones on. It makes it a lot easier to move the games, and of course the game can be stabilized. And if you put the game on carpet, you definitely want to put new ones on, otherwise you're going to just tear your carpet apart with these old ratty ones. You see how terrible they are. So got some new ones, put them on there, put some new eyes in there too to make sure they're nice and secure and they look great. And then you can see we started the process of putting new T-molding on. This game is interesting because the T-molding wraps all the way around the game, which required a little bit of gymnastics here. I laid it on the ground and did it on the side, and then had to kind of hoist it in the air with my dolly to get the bottom. But new T-molding is probably the easiest thing to do to make your game look great again. Some people like to put color T-molding on. I, for a minute, thought I might put like baby blue on there. I'd seen some people online do it, but I just went basic black, decided to make it more factory correct. And here in the inside, you can see the result of all that cleaning. It looks pretty amazing in here, and this may not even have been the final pass of the cleaning, but inside and out, it's looking great. Especially if you're putting these in your house. I mean, the last thing you want to do is have them stink. Old games tend to smell, air them out, scrub them down. Even the back looks good. I was super happy that the original back door was included with this game. Sometimes they're missing. I put these corner protectors on the front. Some people don't like these, and I don't blame them, but there was a little bit of water damage on the one side, so that should help it spread or stop it from spreading in the future. And here it is. We put it in the house, and it's looking good. It's fully functional and just looking amazing. It smells like roses, and it joins the rest of the games here in the line. So I personally feel this is the best looking cabinet Atari ever made. This is a unique cabinet, although it shared some elements with the game Millipede, and there was a game called Agent X, which would become Cloak and Dagger. They didn't make very many of those. I think mostly the dedicated ones were essentially prototypes. So you have this Mylar marquee that we kind of went over before when we talked about the restoration, and the light reflects underneath it here. It's kind of a braided plastic here that gives a really neat kind of waterfall light effect on the speakers, and then the Atari logo also lights up from the same just one neon light. Just a smoked glass, a lot like Tempest here. There's no design on the bezel. And then the control panel, where you have the light up trackball. This is probably one of the most famous elements from this game, super unique to this game. And they've also started going to getting rid of what sometimes they'll call the cone or tent buttons, the 1 and 2 player Atari button games that start the game. They've just integrated it with the jump buttons on either side. Now, one of the things that just
love about this game, one of many things, is the MC Escher kind of inspired artwork here with the kind of three-dimensional grid that just flows all through the sides, all through the front panel art, everywhere. It just really encapsulates not only what the game is, since this is not some sort of, you know, artist rendition of some monster you're going to see. This is pretty much what the game actually looks and plays like, and that it flows on the front. And Atari didn't do a whole bunch of games with front artwork like this near the kick panel. And the artwork, luckily, is in very good condition. It's a little faded on the front. A lot of them are. You can see that the gems are no longer red. They're kind of a light pink. Strangely enough, though, the red on Bentley Bear's hat is still intact. So it's interesting that didn't fade. But we're going to retouch this. I tried to do it with a Prismacolor marker. It just wasn't working out. So I'm going to get some paint and do it correctly. Crystal Castles came from the factory of Atari in 1983 in 3 different ways. The dedicated upright, which is probably the most common, although they made less than 5,000 copies. They made about 500 cocktail variations, and they also offered it as a conversion kit for some older Atari games like Missile Command, some other games like Dig Dug and Kangaroo, and some Atari games that weren't super popular or didn't go very well, like the game Arabian. But in the grand context of things, even though Crystal Castles was somewhat of a hit for Atari, it really was a pale comparison compared to production numbers of other famous Atari games like Asteroids or Centipede or Pole Position or Star Wars, which had much bigger production runs. Now, some of that may not be the game's fault. The market in 1983 was diminishing for arcade games and home video games, and they were right on the verge of a huge economic collapse for the industry that would spell doom and gloom for a lot of these companies, including Atari. So if you've never played Crystal Castles before, first of all, how dare you? Second of all, it's a lot like a combination of Pac-Man, where instead of collecting dots and avoiding monsters, you're avoiding monsters and collecting crystals or gems. And then it also has the element of a lot of the early platform games like Donkey Kong and Congo Bongo, where you are jumping and dodging, but the freedom of going places and with the different levels and the elevators in this game, it's a little more complex. And I think the trackball control actually helps a lot with navigating in that kind of pseudo 3D environment. And keep in mind, this was 1983, so this was really kind of the edge of technology as far as graphics go. All right, so I got my quarter, because I always like to have my coin mix work. And I hit start. And this is the first level. And the other interesting thing here is that the monsters will also eat the gems. So in order to get the bonus, you have to eat the last one. And then we get the bonus. We have the honey pot, which is a bonus. Doesn't really do anything other than points. These guys are pretty smart. Now the other thing you can do with the gem eaters is when they're eating, you can actually eat them, but only while they're eating. And the timing is very critical, and as the game gets higher in the levels. There's our hat. Now we're indestructible for a second, and I totally didn't do anything with it. Now I gotta contend with these two knuckleheads up here. So this might be kind of interesting. I died. There we go. Alright, Berthilda's castle. This is the final boss. And there's Berthilda. So what we'll do is we'll come get our hat, and then we can get her. And the other cool thing too about this game is, see, there's all these three-dimensional elements where you can actually be in the castle or behind things. It's pretty amazing. this level real quick just so you can kind of see what it does in between the levels. And that noise you hear means I'm taking too long and it's going to send bees after me. Hilda's chasing us. And the levels get more and more complex and more villains come up. And that's pretty much the game. And there go the bees right there.
So that's about it for this video, and thanks for watching. Very excited to have a Crystal Castles in my collection. This is my holy grail. Over the last 20 years, I've had an opportunity to buy a couple, but none quite as nice as this, or the ones that were offered to me were just basket cases, or the conversions and not the dedicated units like this one. So again, thanks for watching. I have some videos that will probably be coming up in the next month or so. We're going to finish up our Rally X, and we have a couple new projects in the works, so keep an eye out and happy hunting. Bye!